Greetings, everyone, Muslim, non-Muslim, ex-Muslim, and everyone in between. It's a beautiful Monday evening here in Minnesota. Eid Mubarak to all the family and to all the Muslims celebrating the end of Ramadan. I myself have just enjoyed a delicious home-cooked meal and just sipping on a little Jack Daniels for tonight. Just right, just the way I like it on the rocks. And I want to spend just a brief moment or so to talk about the last video where we tapped into the dilution of divine revelation and the Isnad system. We had a lot of great comments and feedback from viewers, and I was really happy with the way we were interacting. We had some Muslims joining in as well. I enjoy that. I always enjoy when the ultra-religious come on and give their comments. A lot of times they do start off a little rough on the edges. I'm not gonna lie, some of them come with their asshole attitudes, and by the end of the comments, they're pretty mellowed out. And that's the goal of what we're kind of trying to do here, is trying to reach common ground between former Muslims and Muslims. We don't want this rivalry to continue. We don't. A lot of you are family, a lot of you are friends, a lot of you are lovers. And so it's important to understand that we want to bridge the gap, not burn the gap. Burn the bridge, rather. Sorry. I think Jack Daniels is kicking in. So I want to continue the discussion and move from the last video and the topic that I talked about, and then move into another area that's connected. And I'm going to share my screen in a moment just so you kind of get a recap for those who may not have seen the last video. I'll just go really quickly through it and then jump into this next area, which is connected. And I want to talk about what I call the listening dilemma. Listening dilemma for those who don't believe in Islam or who are non-believers, and then the listening phenomenon for those who are believers who hold that Muhammad did hear Gabriel, he did hear an angel, he did hear Allah in that sense of Islamic revelation. And I have my own questions, and I think one that's really one that I've been trying to find the answer for, and even when I was losing my faith, was how did Muhammad hear the voice of Gabriel? This is an important question. I think that remains unanswered. And I think it's important that we look at that. What does that look like? What does the listening process consist of? And that's because one of the problems here is Islam is a textual religion. And what we get from the Islamic text are not just the sayings of Muhammad, but the statements of the ulama, the muhaddithun, the scholars of hadith. And the problem is they never tell us what that looks like. And I want to kind of break that down in hopes maybe we can get some kind of answers. I'm just curious to get a more realistic understanding of the listening process, Muhammad listening to Gabriel and, everything that goes with that. We never get the ulama explaining. Now, let me just stop there. We do have a hadith, as I mentioned in the previous video, where there is an account of where Muhammad talks about how he receives the al-wahy, the divine revelation. And there's the ringing of the bells, and he says in a dream, and then there's that one where he says he sees Gabriel in the form of a man and he speaks to him. And that's an important one that I want to focus on. Maybe later we'll touch on those other two areas. But there's a listening process there that we're not getting a full picture on, because listening involves more than just using the ears. I mean, if he sees a man in front of him that's in the form of that's Gabriel, I'm sorry, in the form of a human being who's really an angel, then we're not getting the full account of the facial expressions. We're not getting those gestures that go with it. We're not getting the body language and etc. And so I put something together just to get a better understanding of where I'm at and trying to continue to explore this important question. And let me just share my screen here so that we can take a look at what I have. And I'm just gonna recap really quick what we looked at last video. And I talked about the notion of Islamic revelation And still drawing from that, I want to talk about, we use as an example Surah Al-Saf. And I use Surah Al-Saf because it uses al-khitab, or what they know as second person mukhatab, which is al-mukhatib rather, is the one who's addressing. The mukhatab would be the one who's receiving and listening to the message. And so we talked about this verse, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu lima taquluna ma la taf'alun, kabura maqtan 'inda Allahi an taqulu ma la taf'alun. Those two verses that are translated there in front of you. And I broke down just really quickly that for the believer, the Quran has to be a monologue of Allah having this discussion with himself before he reveals it. And then if not, from the perspective of the non-Muslim, then it's a diary of Muhammad's daily thoughts. I talked about this, and a lot of people have reached out to me, especially Muslims, perplexed by the idea of the Quran being a yomiyat, of being a diary of Muhammad's feelings, his moods, what he's thinking, what he's going through. And I think it's important that we look at it that way from a non-believer, non-Muslim, or a former Muslim perspective. I mean, that's just the way I look at it now. And so I just want to give a little context because the next two slides are going to speak to this particular area here. And we talked about this being time. I went from, the way Muslims reading the Quran, and even the Torah is read this way. A lot of the Semitic languages are read this way, or at least Hebrew and Arabic. And we talked about time going from that way. And we talked about the idea of the pre-Quran and then the Lahu Mahfuz existing before the first-hand account of Allah speaking. And that first-hand account is Allah speaking to Jibril, to Gabriel. And then there's the second-hand account of Jibril taking that, what he hears, and conveying it to Muhammad, and then going to the companions. And so if we go a step further and now delve into the listening dilemma, or the listening phenomenon, depending on which side you take. Remember, listening dilemma, I mean towards the position of the non-believer, and the listening phenomenon towards the believer, because they believe it's some supernatural phenomenon that happened. And so this next slide kind of looks at the Islamic notion of speaking and listening. And so where we're at here, when you see Allah's name, just really quick, let me just go back here. We're not including the pre-Quran and the Lahu Mahfuz. So you have that context there that, this is post pre-Quran and Lahu Mahfuz when we get to the first-hand account, which is right here, right? So first-hand account, second-hand account, and then on and on and on. And so what we get is Allah using spoken Arabic to Gabriel. And I want to pause here for a minute because I think it's important that we ask a few other questions that come to mind here, for me at least. When Allah is speaking to Gabriel, one of the questions that I have, and I'm trying to formulate it in the right way in my head, is, are Muslims saying that the spoken Arabic of the Quran is Allah's native language? Or are they saying that Allah is using the Arabic language as a medium and he has his own native language that we're not aware of? And I think those are important questions to ask. And if anyone knows, please in the comments, provide some Islamic texts that specifically state this, Qala Allah, Qala Rasul, Qala al-ulama, if we want to go even further after that, in regards to that question. So we start with Allah, and from Allah to Gabriel is spoken Arabic, and then from Gabriel to Muhammad is spoken Arabic, and then from Muhammad to the companions, again, spoken Arabic. And then it isn't until the companions decide to put the Quran and compile it together, and we get the written Arabic, right? And so it goes from spoken discourse to written discourse. When initially, when we go back to this idea of the pre-Quran and the Lahu Mahfuz, it goes from pre-Quran, meaning thoughts in Allah's mind that he then puts on paper in the Lahu Mahfuz. Remember the hadith that I talked about in the last video? And then from that, Allah then decides to utter those words and have them spoken. And it's Gabriel who hears them, and then it's Muhammad who hears Gabriel, right? That's the isnad. Okay, so hopefully this makes some sense here about what I'm talking about with the Islamic notion of speaking and listening. So this covers the first part of it, the speaking part, right? Now, embedded with that is the listening part, right? Because you have two interlocutors. In this case, we would say this would be Jibril speaking to Muhammad, and that's what's going on there. Now, let's move on to the final slide, and I'm going to talk about here where I have my questions, okay? And I know you don't see the bar that I'm moving out of the way, but it's blocking this. And let me move myself over here. Now in this slide, I want the viewers to think about the listening process that goes with the idea of Muhammad hearing Jibril, okay? Or Gabriel. Give me 1 second. I am a bit parched. Now we have to understand the listening process as simultaneous integration of input from multiple sources, both linguistic and non-linguistic. This goes back to the notion that I talked about when Muhammad is hearing Gabriel. It encompasses more than just the listening part. It is also those facial expressions, the gestures, the body language, etc. And so when we talk about, like we mentioned Surah Al-Saf, the Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu lima taquluna ma la taf'alun. Let's just take that first part of the verse in Surah Al-Saf. Oh, those of you who believe, why do you say that which you do not do? And we can consider this, since we don't have the Quran, we don't have audio of the actual Jibril speaking to Muhammad, we can consider it data in the sense of speech that's passed down. And we just saw the isnad for that, right? And so here's where, and I have this image here to kind of just provide emphasis. So what we see here, this is Jibril speaking, and then this is Muhammad's ear. He's listening and what's going on through his mind, okay? And so Jibril is uttering these words. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu limma taquluna ma la taf'alun. So you have to think about it. The Quran was revealed in this way. And so what's going on here is Muhammad's listening to this, right? He's hearing Gabriel say this. Who's the speaker? Muhammad's the listener. And you have two things that are going on in the listening process. And this is something that in my field in applied linguistics, when I teach, speaking and listening is something that I help second language learners with. When we listen, even native language, we do two things. We have a top-down process and we have a bottom-up process. Now, the bottom-up process, it decodes the incoming speech, which is the data. In this case, this would be the verse that Gabriel is uttering to Muhammad. And then there's a top-down process that's going on at the same time. And that's that background knowledge, the schemata that interprets that data and creates these expectations for new input. And so what we see here, and I have here, Muhammad only heard Jibril, not Allah's voice. And we could talk about maybe in later videos, those who have put forward that Muhammad heard Allah. But let's just deal with what we know. In Islamic text, it's very clear Muhammad hears Jibril, Gabriel. And so when Gabriel utters the Quran and Muhammad hears it, Muhammad is using both top-down processing and bottom-up processing. And what's going on in that time are all of these different elements of what he's listening to. And that's intonation, those are the thought groups, those are segmentation, prominence, all of these things take a huge, they play an important role in that listening process. And this is what's lost. This is what the ulama does not convey to us, because this is what leads to Muhammad comprehending, oh, those of you who believe, why do you say what you do not do? And it's very important that we understand how that intonation goes in, how that thought group goes in, how that segmentation and that prominence, because we know it wasn't just, that's not what's happening. That would sound like gibberish, but Muhammad is hearing something. And we don't have a full account of what that's like, right? And that experience is missing. And so that in this video is something that I want to explore or explaining to listeners for us to give our comments, to give feedback, and kind of explore this whole notion. So let me just quickly just recap and kind of tell you where I'm going, where I want to see some feedback and even get some kind of understanding from others. The notion of Islamic revelation, we talked about why revelation cannot be acceptable. We talked about the pre-Quran, the Lahu Mahfuz, and the first, second, and third hand accounts of the Quran and how they were heard by Muhammad. And I know this is kind of redundant, but I just want everyone to see where I'm going with it one last time. And then we're talking about this Islamic notion of speaking and listening. And that speaking and listening, everything that I talked about in that last slide, that's what's going on here with Allah and Gabriel. That's what's going on with Gabriel and Muhammad. And that's what's going on with the companions. But the companions hear Muhammad, right? And they convey to us how that happens. And then the companions tell us how the Quran is compiled. What is a mystery? What we don't understand, what we don't have a full account of, is Muhammad listening to Gabriel and the whole thought process that goes behind that when we look at what the listening process looks like from the aspect of not just linguistics, but also of the aspect of applied linguistics. And so I'm curious, what do you as the viewer think? How do you feel about that? What would you like to share? What other questions do you have? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Please, I'd love to hear from everyone. And until the next video, please stay gold.